I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. My guest this week on the show is Ramez Naam. He was born in Egypt, but moved with his family to the US when he was 3, studied computer science, and went to work at Microsoft. Not many people have patents that they hold jointly with Bill Gates, but Ramez does. He worked there for 13 years, spotted the trends in energy, switched to energy. He is a specialist now in seeing the future. He's written 5 books, 2 of them about the future of technology and how it will act to improve the human condition, and 3 award-winning science fiction books. I met Ramez when we served together on the advisory board of Shell New Energies. He's an extraordinary visionary. He does indeed see the future. Please welcome Ramez Naam.
Michael, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for that warm intro. I feel like you were one of the first people to really see the future of clean energy, and in many ways, I followed in your footsteps. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, there's a risk here that this is the sort of mutual supporters club, because I think we sort of egged each other on. Because I certainly didn't have revelation and see the future. That's not how this stuff worked. And actually, yeah. I don't know, I'd be interested to hear your process through the years, because I kind of saw a little bit of the future, put a few pieces together, saw a bit further, and then you came along and you're like, no, it's going to be much bigger and better. And so I was like, wait, I can double down and go further. And I think we've been doing this for some time, haven't we?
We have. That's fantastic to hear. A lot of it for me was spending 13 years at Microsoft and working in tech. In computing, everyone talks about Moore's Law constantly. You know that 2 years from now, computing power and memory and bandwidth are going to cost half of what they do today. And in 10 years, it'll be a factor of 100. And so you just plan for it. You build software knowing that you'll have these additional resources. Or Google famously tells its engineers, what would you do if computing and storage and bandwidth were free? So that's the world that I came from. And when I started looking, I really got interested in climate and started looking for solutions. When I started
Which
looking
year
for
was
solutions,
this? Let's do this. So you were at Microsoft and you were working on Outlook, but you were hearing about climate. So which kind of year are we talking about?
Yeah. So this is my second stint at Microsoft. I had quit once and founded a startup and written my first book. And I was back and I was working on what would become Bing. And it was also sort of one of Microsoft's first cloud computing forays, you will, and machine learning and interesting. I learned a ton. And so it was around, I heard about climate all the time, but it was really around 2008, 2007 maybe, that I made a resolution. It was a very cliche environmental awakening, actually. I was on a beach in Mexico, and I was playing in the waves, and it was just gorgeous. This sort of stunning azure-colored water that you see on Instagram. And it was really there. And there was some litter on the beach. And litter is not actually the world's biggest environmental problem, though it is where plastics in the ocean come from. But so I had the day almost to myself. So I just started thinking, this planet's so beautiful. Is there an environmental problem? Is climate change real? How bad is it? Will innovation just solve it automatically? And what's my responsibility as a human being? And that started me down the road of researching everything I possibly could.
Do you remember the piece of litter? What was it?
It was a strip. Basically above the high tide line, there was a strip of litter. And above that, there was stuff that people, tourists or locals just tossed their trash. There was no trash collection. So there's a fair bit.
Right. Because you and I interact a lot on Twitter. And on Twitter, I've got this kind of, I'd almost call it an artwork, where I post Red Bull cans, because it really upsets me that Red Bull's advertising, the very first ad was a guy cracking a can and then throwing the can behind him, and he gets wings and he flies up and wreaks revenge on a bird. And that ethos of littering really annoys me. And it continues, and you just see these Red Bull cans. I take pictures and I post them. So litter, there's a common theme here. That's litter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's actually, litter is usually the first environmental problem that gets solved as a country gets richer, right? Like when you're very poor, you just toss your trash wherever, but you start to notice it. People go after the environmental problems that are most local and most visible first. And then things that are sort of perceived, that are invisible and perceived as distant in place or time are much, much later. And that's part of what climate change has suffered from.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And in environmental theory, you have this thing called the Kuznets curve, where countries get wealthier. Countries start poor and they mess everything up, and then they get wealthy and they don't want to live in those conditions. And so then they start improving it, and you get this kind of pollution goes up, pollution goes down. It's a beautiful theory. It's contested by some people who don't want to believe that things will sort of get better. But it kind of doesn't deal with planetary boundaries, things where your local actions actually have implications around the world. So you kind of ended up then at the climate problem, and and then, but you brought that together with this kind of Moore's law thinking out of silicon technology.
Yeah, and what happened was I read everything that I could, and I found books mostly in two camps on climate specifically, and resource use and population growth and in planetary boundaries. I found a bunch of books basically saying there is no problem, it's all a hoax, or the problem will solve itself automatically, don't worry. And then I found a bunch of books saying either we're doomed, there's nothing we can do, or degrowth is the only answer. And that didn't seem very satisfactory when we still have billions of people in poverty. And so I said, well, okay, I want to write my own book that says, obviously there's a real problem, and our ability to innovate, if we focus on it, is great. And one of the things that I did is I looked at all the solutions, and I downloaded some data from NREL that was just the cost per watt of solar. And this is actually, Swanson's law would get coined a year or two later. I didn't know about who Swanson was, but I just put this in Excel and I charted it, and I found a log linear relationship. I found that over time, it was dropping in price at a fairly predictable rate. It turns out that's not the right metric, as you did a lot of work at BNEF and since then on your own. It's really a function of scale. It also turns out that Moore's law actually isn't quite right, and computing costs are also better characterized by Wright's law or the learning curve, and it's really scale that is the best predictor of computing costs, not time. But even looking at the time-based formulation of it, I said, this is an exponential technology. This is a technology that looks like computing. And I wrote a piece for Scientific American, actually, a blog post, and I just said, look, it looks like around, this is 2011 is when this piece came out. It says, it looks like around 2015, if these trends continue, we'll have the first solar at roughly parity with coal at LCOE. And by 2020, we'll have solar half the price of electricity from a coal power plant in sunny parts. Yeah.
Now, I've got to interrupt you. Two service announcements. Well, one service announcement, which is traditional. Sadly, when we have guests in the US, it's the morning, and so they can't share a beer or a beverage with me, but I can because it's the evening here. So that's the first thing, is I'm going to crack my beer, and I'm going to do the thing that is becoming traditional on this show. The other service announcement is that I have your quote here from that paper. It says you wrote in 2011, Scientific American, in an article called Smaller, Cheaper, Faster, and I assume that's the piece you're thinking of. Yeah. You wrote, the cost of solar in the average location in the US will cross the current average retail electricity price of 12 cents per kilowatt hour in around 2020. 12 cents in 2020, or 9 years from now. In fact, given that retail electricity prices are currently rising, earlier, around 2018, and as early as 2015 for the sunniest parts of America. So you're right, 2015. And then you wrote, 10 years later, in 2030, solar electricity is likely to cost half what coal electricity does today. But, I've said that this episode is about seeing the future and you're the man, but actually that's a terrible forecast.
I was
we were horribly wrong, weren't we?
And yes, and you as well. Every forecast I've made about solar has been wrong in the exact same way. Solar prices have always dropped faster than forecast.
That's right.
So that's a lesson too.
That's right. And, in our defense, we've been wrong. We've been horribly wrong with the speed of reductions in cost, but we've been less magnificently, horribly, appallingly wrong than the mainstream energy experts, right?
That's right.
I mean, how have they been doing?
So there's another blog post I had out earlier this year called Solar's Future is Insanely Cheap, where I looked at the cost forecasts from the IEA, International Energy Agency, which we both love to hate, I think. And
no, I love to love. I just mock forecast occasionally. Yeah.
I would like them to do better, basically.
Right.
It's tough love. And the US EIA. And basically, so actual solar prices have dropped, they're a quarter now of what the IEA said they would be at this time in 2010. They're about half of what I said they would be. But moreover, they're cheaper now. I don't have the post or the spreadsheets in front of me, but actual solar prices now are cheaper than what the IEA thought they'd be decades.
So I've got the bullet points from that piece.
Awesome.
I've done my homework here. 7 to 10 years ahead of what you forecast in 2015. 10 to 15 years ahead of what you forecast in 2011 in that piece, smaller, cheaper, faster. It actually went 10 to 15 years faster. Yeah. 30 to 40 years ahead of what the IEA forecast in 2014 solar technology. I mean, these are 2014. Yeah. This is 6 years ago.
6 years ago,
by 30 to 40 years.
Yeah.
Right?
It's crazy.
And 50 to 100 years, and possibly forever ahead of what they forecast in 2010. So we're already at solar prices that are probably below what. I mean, and by the way, in defense of my friends of the IEA, the EIA has been even worse than the IEA.
Yeah, the EIA has been like this.
I mean, every year they produce these forecasts, which are essentially of almost like a reversion to costs that they must surely know we had years ago.
That's right.
I just don't get it.
And in fact, the EIA does this funny thing. The IEA does this somewhat too. The EIA will put out an article about what's the cost of different power generators in the U.S. And they'll look at 2 or 3 years hence. If you wanted to start work on one now, get financing and so on, and it's going to come online in 2022, and the cost they'll say for solar will be like twice the cost of projects built this year. Yes. And so there's something really funny going on there, to say the least.
Yes, and I can understand that they want to sort of normalize in case there's some subsidized. These are, the things that we're talking about are, non-subsidized.
Unsubsidized prices.
We kind of we give a bit of the benefit of the doubt. Was it really subsidized? Did they get some money from, around the world? Maybe the IFC or from in the Gulf, the countries maybe give the land free, and so you kind of have to adjust for that. But the bottom line is they're just systematically wrong. I mean, I think 15 years in a row they've been wrong in the same direction forever. And then they'll say things like, "Oh, it's not a forecast." Like, I don't know, what is it then?
And they call it a scenario, but they say, it's the no new policy. They've changed the name of it. Now it's steps, right? But it's the scenario of the world doesn't push policy any faster than what's planned, right? But that is not a satisfactory answer, because policy in general has been getting taking more steps towards making deploying solar and wind and storage and so on. But you have situations like in 2019, you had the biggest rollback of solar policy on Earth when China reduced its solar goals, and yet solar prices dropped again. And so you look at it and you try to decompose the variables. And yes, so policy and innovation are intimately intertwined. More policy drives scale drives prices down. But the changes that are happening are not primarily policy-based. The learning rates, the rate at which these technologies get cheaper is something they just don't get. And this is also true of batteries. It's true of EVs, and it's true even to a lesser extent in wind, both onshore and offshore. Not as markedly as solar, batteries, and EVs, where they're really, it's hard to even find an EV cost forecast from the past, But you look at there's some battery cost forecasts that you'll get from the IEA or the EIA. They're sporadic. They don't happen every year. But you look at those versus actual pace of cost decline, it's the same issue as solar at almost the same degree of miss.
And it's not just the prices. I mean, this translates into the volumes where, you know, it's just been, and to this point about it being a scenario, and well, you see, I really dislike that sort of thinking, because it's almost like victim blaming, because people out there in the real world use it as a forecast. It's somehow their fault for not realizing that all of this work, all of this taxpayers' money at the at the EIA, out of the Department of Energy, IEA, don't quite know how it sort of makes its way there, but there's all this huge effort, and we're really supposed to ignore it, because all it is a scenario. It's not supposed to actually be an indication of what we might see, you know, and then, so it's kind of like, I have a saying that if it quacks like a forecast, you know, then it is a forecast. If people use it like a forecast, it's a forecast. And then you get things like, they'll say, oh, you know, our central scenario. Well, in what way is it central if it's not meant to be the most likely? It just doesn't, you know, if you want to do scenarios, do them like shells, sky, mountains, ocean, whatever, and then give them all equal prominence in your literature. You don't say, well, here's the central one. Oh no, don't assume that we like that one most. We just call it central. And then of course, they'll do things like blame the changes in policy, but never actually go back and say, well, if we run the same model with what happened to policy, well, they should be able to prove that they nail the price, nail the volume, but they never do that check, because of course they don't, because experience.
I've asked for that. Right? I've asked even just for there's tables of cost estimates that go into the models, which are more detailed than what you see in the PDF reports. I've asked for those tables in past years. Radio silence. Nobody replies. Well, right? Because I'm not sure they want anyone to see that number.
But that's very interesting, because there is something called open mod. Sometimes I'll tweet and I'll use this thing called free the models. Yes, and I think this is very powerful. And by the way, I think that you and I need to, you know, maybe work on this to increase the profile, because in my view, everybody who has a model or a future for an energy system or a transport system should be publishing their assumptions and the code, open source, let anybody play with it, let any student find the mistakes, let anybody say, oh, well, if you used this, I don't know, advanced geothermal or this fuel cell, let them swap out pieces of it, let them find better scenarios. Yeah. If we got the creativity of thousands of people working on these models, I guarantee you that there'd be fewer places for the incumbents to hide. So open mod, if there are people watching and want to learn about that, I'll put some links in the notes. Open mod and free the models, hashtag free the models. And I'm convinced that it would accelerate the decarbonization of the world's energy system.
Yeah. I think those are both great, you know, directions to go. I will say the IEA is what's going to get used as a default, right? Well, people are going to use the IEA, the EIA, BP, since BP's statistical historical data is the best, BP's future forecasts get sort of some of the credibility from that. And the challenge with these, so I think the IEA would say this, the reason they do the no new policy scenarios and now steps, the stated policy scenarios, is that they believe their audience is policymakers. And they think policymakers will look at this and say, oh, we're not doing enough policy. We will have to take this to do more policy. I've talked to policymakers, I've sat with prime ministers. I've never heard them ever say that. I have heard them talk about IPCC reports somewhat. Who does mention IEA numbers to me? Executives at oil companies who say, well, the IEA says clean energy is very, very far away, or that EVs aren't going to grow at anything like a rate that affects oil demand, and so we're just going to double down and invest more in oil production or whatnot. So it's very counterproductive.
So I'm going to defend the IEA. I've just been on there was a commission on urgent energy efficiency.
I saw that.
I'm delighted to serve on it, and I think that, but I'll defend them on this in two ways, I guess. One is that they also produce a sustainable development scenario. In fact, they've just produced technology perspectives and the sustainable development scenario, which is consistent with 1.5 degrees, I think, and certainly with 2 degrees. And they are giving it much, much more prominence. And if I look at when I first when I first interacted with the IEA, I was like, you are abdicating your responsibility. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, it's really getting a lot better. It's still, I think, I think there's ways to go, but it's a lot better. And they do give prominence to the SDS scenario. But the other thing that has just been an absolute eye-opener for me in the last 2 years, there's me, beating on the IEA and the EIA and others for being too pessimistic. And then I got under the hood of the scenarios at the IPCC, and it's like,
my goodness.
OMG. I mean, OMG, these things are just ridiculous. And if you look at, if you look at the solar prices that are used in those scenarios, and these are the scenarios when you turn on the television and you see the show that you see the news story says, the penguins are going to be extinct by 2100. And you think, that's terrible. And, my kids get all depressed. And then I have to go in and I look at the literature. It's always these extreme scenarios, RCP 8.5. Yeah. And when you go into it and you say, well, what solar cost is in there? And you're like, 35 cents? Really? Or whatever it is. It's just, it's insane.
And you see coal consumption.
Traction. I can't explain how stupid it is. They're in a little bubble.
Well, I think actually there is change possibly happening. I mean, I don't have any insight into the IPCC process, but I think that sometimes people feel personally attacked, and that can be hard on a forum like Twitter.
I've been attacking them because I've tried ways. I'm like, okay, what else can I do? Because this thing, it discredits the work of you and me. We're trying to say change is possible, change is happening. This is what's going. You should invest. And then you've got these people. No, everything's going to be underwater always in every.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in AR6 due in next year and 2022. But I think actually the article by two climate scientists, by Glenn Peters and Zeke Hausfather, I think that was actually, it spoke in the language of people doing these IAMs, and it laid out some of the things that are I don't know if that was in the article or not, or other Twitter, some of the things that are implausible, like coal consumption going up by a factor of 5, when the peak of coal consumption on planet Earth was probably 7 years ago in 2013, and it's likely to be mostly gone, in another 2-3 decades. So I think it's things like that need to, people aren't going to stop publishing worst case scenarios, unfortunately. But hopefully more attention can be shifted to scenarios that are more plausible and bad enough that we had to do more to avoid them.
Yeah, so first of all, one person I'm going to mention, because he's been a real hero of that, he's been really educating me and others, is Justin Ritchie.
Yes, Justin Ritchie also.
So much good work on how much coal is actually in those scenarios. And he was really like this lone voice in the wilderness.
Absolutely.
And when I focused on what he was saying, and I thought, well, this can't be right, it is. I'm still very, very worried. Because what that article, I think it was a piece in Nature, wasn't it? It was by Hausfather and Peters, and it basically says that we're on track for 3 degrees, not the 5 to 7 degrees of the extreme scenarios, and 3 degrees is perfectly horrible. And you and I know we need to bend the curve a lot further and so on. The problem I have with what's going on towards the AR6 is there are thousands of papers, science peer-reviewed papers, that either explicitly say that these extreme scenarios, RCP 8.5, is business as usual, or they just use it as business as usual without saying that. And even the US National Climate Assessment, right, which is supposed to be gold standard, it actually says that the cost of climate change, or the value of mitigation, it calculates as the difference between RCP 8.5 and RCP 4.5, right? Now, one's got a population of 12 billion and one's got a population of 8.7 billion. You cannot take the difference between those two and say, this is what happens if we do more solar power. It's just illegitimate. It's illegitimate, and it's deeply, deeply in the literature. So I'm very pessimistic because, of course, I don't need to attack it. I can just shut up and say, right, I'm going to work with, I'm fine. My worry is that the people who don't want climate action can ignore everything because they'll find this one extreme scenario buried, or not just buried, just polluting the whole piece of work. And I'm really, really worried about that, I'll be honest.
I mean, the question of climate persuasion and what works is a complicated one. I mean, there's a set of people who you're just not going to persuade, period. But I do think that extreme statements about climate change that turn out to not be true, or are just, very difficult to believe, or, that are made, and then predictions that are made for short-term changes that don't occur, are used to discredit climate models and can sway the middle. And I think there's also, I'm connected to some groups that include children working on climate change. And I do think there's psychological trauma that is done to people when the message is, it's hopeless, you're doomed, as opposed to the message being, we have some real work to do, and there's going to be some real challenges, like the fires that we have going on right now, multiple causes going in here on the West Coast. There's the coral reefs, potentially being devastated at 2 degrees Celsius or more. There's real issues, but those issues are things that we have to move faster for. We have to do more on both reducing emissions and on adaptation, and maybe doing some things people don't want to consider right now, but they don't spell the end of the world. That we can come out of this as a civilization that has survived, that has gone through a hard time, but is better, healthier, richer on a cleaner world afterwards. And I think people need that message to not be traumatized and to maintain hope and to work towards a better world.
I think that, and there's a theme, in some of these shows. So we've had Cristiana Figueres, who's, famously, essentially turned the climate negotiations around by being optimistic. Just assume success. Everybody wants to be involved in success. And over a period of years, she just got everybody back on board, including myself, who was the biggest skeptic about that whole UNFCCC process. We've also had Bertrand Piccard, who's the chap who flew around the world in an electric plane. And, so there is a theme. And of course, I'm famously optimistic. I actually think, no. And so I don't know whether I guess I'm self-selecting, or I'm selecting guests who agree with me maybe. But there is another set of people who just think you need to be more apocalyptic. You just need to double down. We haven't acted on climate because people aren't scared enough about, extinctions, and they're not scared enough about sea level rise. And so, we need to suppress any news stories that say that we might actually be near peak emissions. We must suppress that. We must pretend we've done nothing. I think
suppressing that would be horrible. But the complicated, I spent a fair bit of time looking at sort of the data on climate persuasion, the various studies that are out there. And I think one of the challenges, and this is true for any political phenomenon, I think, which unfortunately climate change is that different messages work on different audiences. So if you want to fire up the base, young people on the far left, and I'm not saying that in a negative way, just on the spectrum, like over here, those apocalyptic messages work to get them motivated, get them marching in the streets, and so on. If you want to win the middle, different messages work, and apocalyptic messages, don't test well. And messages about degrowth and having to limit consumption test extremely poorly in the middle, or even for the small fraction of the right, not the far right, but the small fraction of the center right that you could peel off. And we know that messages around economic growth, around clean energy being cheaper, saving money, about air pollution, about forests and parts of nature that are not so politicized, and about innovation and about new business opportunities, that those are what work the best on the middle and a little bit to the right. And so
I'm depressed that you said the small section of the right that's persuadable, because I come from that. I am that section. I've been beating the drum for that section for literally more decade and a half, and I don't think it's that small. I mean, it may appear small in on Twitter and in these very polarized environments. Maybe the US is just sort of beyond maybe there is no center right in the US anymore. Australia,
there might not much of one.
Yeah, but in the UK, that centre right is big. I mean, the kind of swivel-eyed right is actually pretty small and getting smaller, which is very gratifying.
It is. I think it is different. Europe looks different than almost any other place on Earth in that political spectrum, and also on how certain messages like degrowth might be a viable political message in Europe. It's not anywhere else on Earth. It's not in the US for a variety of cultural and political reasons, and it's definitely not in the developing world. It's definitely not in China. It's definitely not in India. In places people don't have physical material abundance, a degrowth message is about as counterproductive as you can get.
So I think it only flies in young, urban Europeans.
Yeah, that could be.
That is literally the only demographic that thinks that degrowth is a good thing. And I look at it and I just, it blows my mind how, first of all, just how sort of illiterate it is, illiterate of history. I mean, it's essentially just, it's the rerunning of revolution versus reform. It's a rerun of the arguments that led to the Great Leap Forward and the Holodomor. It's centralized, idealistic, but then backed up by some very nasty sort of totalitarian strains and so on. And to me, it's just glaringly obvious.
Population control.
And yet it resonates with urban European young people and nobody else, as you said.
And I think it is connected to these apocalyptic messages. I will say one other thing about like the right in the US. So I wrote an article about climate policy when the Green New Deal was announced. I don't really love the Green New Deal, I'll be totally honest. I thought, among other things, well, it had too much command and control that wasn't going to work. And to me, the most vital thing to do to decarbonize is make clean technologies obviously cheaper than dirty technologies. And then everyone around the world, not just in your country, just out of self-interest, whether they care about climate or not, picks the clean stuff because it makes more sense. And so I thought the Green New Deal missed that. It was focused on, in some cases, there was a tinge of industrial policy, meaning the state taking over stuff and doing it, that I don't think would produce that outcome. So I wrote an article about what that would look like. And that's at TechCrunch. It's called How to Decarbonize America and the World. And one of the things that I put there was the politics of things in the US. And one thing that's very clear is clean energy is super loved in the US, basically on right and left. Basically, in every congressional district in the US, solar is the #1 most popular way to get your energy. Wind is almost always #2, and then it's like a 20-point drop to natural gas. The entire US supports electric vehicles. But what happens is, if you just say, let's do solar, you can get a good chunk of the right. I have deeply, deeply, deeply conservative friends, family friends, who believe that Trump is absolutely the right guy, they're gonna vote for him again, and they love solar. But they can love solar, but if you start talking about solar for climate change, the popularity drops. So to some extent, I think that the most effective climate messages for the center to the right would not be about climate change at all. They're just about how awesome, how affordable, how cheap, how better clean energy and clean transport are, and don't even bother mentioning climate. And that's the way to win over people for whom climate is an emotional or religious issue that they have a deep, they're triggered by it when they hear the term.
Now, and I agree with you. And the other one that we've not talked about, but you always have to put up there, is energy efficiency. Because it sounds like, ooh, sacrifice, but it's not. It's saving money. Yeah. So have you got better things to do with your money than spend it on your utility bill? I do.
Yeah.
So I want to do this stuff. And you then scale it up to a city or whatever, and those messages they resonate universally, I think.
Yeah.
Solar. So you also teach. You're the chair of the program at Singularity University, and this is where your kind of gung-ho solar singularity. I actually wrote a piece in 2018. I got there just before you, on this the potential for a solar singularity.
Yeah.
And actually, to be fair, I actually think you could do the same with a wind, and potentially offshore wind. I mean, the learning rate is not as high, but it's the same direction.
Yeah.
And it ends up the same place. Very, 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 very cheap. But variable electricity. And I was thinking about, well, what happens if solar doesn't? Most of the models, IEA, EIA, but even BNEF and all of them, they all have these renewable resources sort of saturate. They all get to like 10%, 20%, 25%, and then they sort of saturate because, it's very difficult. It's variable, and there's only so far you can go, and we don't want to lose our jobs by saying anything really, out there. And I was just looking at it and going, well, what happens if this just keeps growing? Because it just becomes, and I recently published, on Twitter, my forecast for like $5 per megawatt hour solar pretty much anywhere in the world by 2100. I mean, it's a long way into the future. Yeah. So by 2050.
Yeah.
And if it gets that cheap, aren't we just going to get, more solar? And I think you called it potentially a pathological level of solar.
I think I did.
And what actually happens in terms of, how does that start to move industry around the world? Or, you're the futurist, right? You tell me what happens when it really goes to a singularity.
Yeah, I mean, singularity is a very big word, but it is the case that the cost is going to be incredibly cheap. It'll still vary by geography. What's probably more important than the cost variability by geography is the capacity factor and seasonality variability by geography, right? So even if, let's say it's $5 a megawatt hour in Australia and 10 or 12 bucks a megawatt hour in the UK, that's still ultra cheap in the UK. The challenge is in the UK, you'll have 3, 4, 5 times. You look at Germany, you get 5 times as much sun in June, July as you do in December, January. And so
the data for this house where I am right now is 13x because it's east-west facing. Sun in the summer to the winter, there's a 12 or 13x difference. You're not heating this house with solar in the winter.
Yeah, and Europe, unlike all other continents today, Europe is a winter peaking energy demand continent, right? At least for electricity. Basically, all the rest of the planet is summer peaking or electricity. So if you add space heating, I think many places actually end up being winter peaking. But I do think with prices that cheap, you end up with geographies like Australia, Mexico, Chile, the US Southwest, Texas, even, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf in general, North Africa, the UAE. You end up with these places where you don't have strong seasonality because you're close to the equator, and where you have deserts. You have dust storms to deal with in some cases, but you have very low precipitation, very few cloudy days. And you start to think, what can I do with solar that's quite reliable? And you may or may not add storage, but there's like certain industrial processes.
In some of those places, you can have wind at 40-50% capacity factor. You've got solar, and you put the two together without any storage, no interconnections, nothing. You're probably at 60% capacity factor, 50-60%. Right. You add a bit of that stuff, you could be at 70-80% of really cheap electricity.
That's right. And then if you can have an industrial process that is able to handle some variability. So you think about things like hydrogen production being one of the ones people are very interested in. There's still questions about what's that hydrogen really going to get used for, but at least there's a $140 billion market for hydrogen for fertilizer and refineries. We may not need that. Semiconductor plants. Desalination is another one. But there may be other processes as well. Aluminum smelting is a gigantic electricity driver. Now people are talking about, using hydrogen for steel manufacturing, but also electrolysis for steel manufacturing. So there might be other tasks where the factory or facility is able to ramp up and down in what it does, or you couple it with a little bit of storage so that it's not abrupt. So you can make it, you don't even have to fill out the entire day, but it sort of has an easy, ramp up and down. And, these industrial processes have some fraction of cost that is the CapEx of the facility and some that's the energy cost. But that's with today's designs. Like desalination today in most parts of the world with 5 or 6 cent electricity per kilowatt hour, it's about half CapEx, half electricity, right? But if you knew that your electricity was going to get really cheap, you might be able to design a different process or a different kind of desalination plant or a steel plant or whatever that was maybe cheaper in CapEx, but a little bit less efficient for electricity, that could use a whole lot of variable electricity and get, you can tune the economics to what the electricity availability is. And I think you'll see people do that. They'll create processes that can use all of this cheap variable electricity.
Right. And then industrial processes migrate to these renewable energy superpowers.
That's right.
That's what's going to happen. So although right now there might be not much energy demand in Australia or Morocco or the Gulf or whatever in the grand scheme of things, but if industry goes to those places, we could end up, really powering a much bigger chunk of the world's economy with renewable electricity than any, EIA, IEA, IPCC, whatever model. And that, to me, that's the singularity, when the economics of the electricity supply starts to override and decide where you do things in the world.
And there are some proof points, right? Iceland has no bauxite ore, but Iceland is one of the larger exporters of aluminum because they have cheap geothermal. So people ship bauxite to Iceland for cheap geothermal electricity to be used to turn it into aluminum. And the UAE, does that with natural gas today, but they're going to have solar a lot cheaper than gas.
Well, and what's your view on high voltage DC interconnections? Because you've got the kind of Buckminster Fuller, the world will all be connected by high voltage DC, because the idea of shipping bauxite to Iceland for processing rather than electricity to wherever the bauxite comes from seems a little crazy. To me, it's clear we're going to have more HVDC, but how far is that going to go?
Well, the real barriers to HVDC are political. They're, citing their NIMBY, not in my backyard, they're landowners along the way. And we see that in Germany, trying to move power from north to south, from the offshore wind sites to the industrial heartland. We see it in the US. And so the technology is there. The rule of thumb is 3% losses per 1,000 kilometers. It's also the case that just to get to very, very high penetration of renewables, if you just build your HVDC grid over the scale of a continent without even going intercontinental, that's enough to get to very, very high renewables penetration. The question is, will we have the political will? China does. China has these lines. The longest line, I think it's the Urumqi to Shanghai line, is 3,400 kilometers long. Right? It's just stunning. That would be Sevilla to Copenhagen is the math I did for Europe. So you could have lots of solar in southern Spain powering good chunks of Europe.
That's almost transatlantic.
It's almost transatlantic, it's true. Yeah. Sevilla, solar from Spain and Portugal could power the eastern seaboard of the US. There is one fascinating thing.
Ramez, the US has this thing I've just discovered about, do you know about the seam? Have you heard of the seam?
Oh, yeah. Between the eastern and western
straight down the middle of the US, across the Rockies, where the east and the west. So you're not even moving power from, Nevada to the eastern seaboard. You're not even doing the easy stuff.
Yeah. Well, you're not even doing Nevada to Illinois. Right?
And then on to wherever. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that has to get fixed, and that's a political issue. I did read a set of fascinating papers from a woman who just graduated with her PhD, and I wish I had her name handy right now because someone should hire her. And she looked at this tech I had never looked at, which was with this idea, taking current AC transmission lines, transmission corridors, and instead of trying to build new transmission lines, which is very, very hard to convince people of, upgrading the power electronics and converting those existing AC lines to HVDC.
Wow.
And her papers are fantastic. You can quadruple, roughly, the amount of energy you can transmit on these lines at a price that's actually similar to or lower than building new HVDC lines, and with maybe close to zero NIMBY. So I'm fascinated by this topic.
If you can find that paper and send the link, we'll put it in the notes for the episode, wherever. This is going to go on YouTube, but it goes out as a podcast, and we can put the notes there as well. So I was going to ask whether you'd heard of things like Sun Cable from Australia to Singapore.
Yes, indeed.
Or there's another one in the UK, X-Links, which is supposed to go from North America around to the UK. And it feels to me a bit like, these are crazy ideas. It's crazy speak. But you know what? So were motorways in its
Yeah.
day. If you'd have talked about a motorway in 1910 or even probably 1915, 1920, people would have said crazy speed. But there came a point when there was a demand, and the policy environment responded generally, through the Depression or post-war, the New Deal and so on. But these things were built. They were built.
Yeah. I don't know about X-Link, but I've spoken to Sun Cable. I know Mike Cannon Brooks, who's the Aussie who
we're going to get him on the show. Yeah.
Mike is amazing, and he's a really good human being.
Yeah.
And so I've looked at Sun Cable, and I think what makes Sun Cable really doable in a sense, or makes it the most, because it's vast. It's a 20 gigawatt solar deployment. And a undersea transmission line to Singapore. Now that's shorter than transatlantic. The real driver there is you have someone that wants the energy to their end, because Singapore really cares about hitting their Paris commitments. But Singapore has essentially no land, and it's not windy. So Singapore they're doing floating ocean solar. Every rooftop basically in Singapore has solar. But you do the math, if you covered every inch of Singapore with solar, it's less than 20% of their electricity. And so it's really the commitment of the Singaporean government and financiers that they have to find a way to get more clean energy. And they don't necessarily have always the best relationships with their neighbors of Malaysia and Indonesia that makes this a potentially viable project.
Okay, so now you talked about batteries, and we've talked about HVDC, and you've said that that everybody loves solar, but there is still this issue of, you talked about the season, because I think the kind of day-night stuff, that all gets taken care of with batteries. Yeah. And we could go into a whole thing about EVs, and they're all terribly exciting and so on. But the real problem is this seasonality, right?
That's
right. What are the other things that you're excited about to solve seasonality?
Yeah, well, it's especially a problem for Europe more than any place else, but it is for the U.S. too. I mean, really, if you think about seasonality, there's
Canada, Japan has also.
Oh, also very true.
I think it's
it's
to do with it's anywhere north, no, and also
anywhere north.
New Zealand, it gets gets cold in New Zealand too, so it's a big problem.
Any place, the less you can depend upon solar, and even the U.S. Northeast, if the U.S. built a national grid, so you have 3 or 4 options, right? One is building continent scale transmission, where you can do that and where the politics allow it. Then if you do that, you can potentially do it with overbuild of solar and wind, and building in solar in the summer and wind in the winter and so on, and having some, even solar in Arizona and Nevada helping the US Eastern Seaboard, solar in Spain, even though it goes down in the winter, as some base load to, not sort of, winter base load to help in these problems. Your second option is just massive overbuild, but that's hard to do in a windy place because wind variability is so much higher than solar. Your third is some sort of, what Jesse Jenkins would call firm low carbon energy.
I wish you'd call it flexible. Geothermal. I don't get this firm thing, but there you go. I love Jesse, but he's got to call it flexible.
Yeah, flexible is another way to do it. Dispatchable, would be the term of art. So whether that's something like... It
starts to sound like 24/7. I think the important thing to get into people's heads is it's got to be flexible. It's got to cut in when the other things aren't there.
That's right. And you have to have some control over when it cuts in, right? And so that could be advances in geothermal, like low temperature geothermal, like Fervo energy, or maybe nuclear. We're going to zap together. I'm a little bit dubious. And then finally, you get to what we'd call like real seasonal storage. And hydrogen is probably the leading technology for seasonal storage, but there are, at least another dozen startups in that sector, including companies like Form Energy, backed by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, that have, they might have a sodium sulfur based chemistry for flow batteries. That's the papers they published. Whether or not that's the actual tech remains to be seen, but where they think they can get sort of the incremental cost per kilowatt hour of storage. The power stack is going to cost a bunch of money, but the incremental cost per kilowatt hour down into the ballpark of $1 or $2 per kilowatt hour, as opposed to, lithium ion might have a floor of $30 a kilowatt hour or something like that. So then you start being able to do more things, but none of them really, none of the seasonal storage technologies really exist yet. Even hydrogen is just kind of just getting to the point. I mean, there's like a couple demo projects working on that. So we still have to, create market structures to create incentives for this, right? There's not really like a separate capacity payment or something like that that you can get to have a seasonal storage system that doesn't do anything most of the year and then kicks in the winter. So once we figure out the market, the way to reward these sort of seasonal storage generators, or even the flexible generators, I think you'll see more momentum on them as well.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, there is biomass and biogas, you know,
Also,
and there is a certain amount of that. And, you know, the Danes call these things golden molecules, you know, because you really want to use it to do something you can't do any other way.
Yeah.
I'm pretty optimistic about hydrogen, to be honest,
Yeah.
because I see the electrolyzer cost just doing this thing
That's
that
true.
you talked about earlier. They're just
Yeah.
so, and they're already, you know, most people don't realize how cheap Chinese electrolyzers already are.
Yeah.
They're all kind of like, oh, you know, let's look at these, you know, boutique electrolyzers in Europe. Well, no, just go and do an alkaline electrolyzer in China. It's already really, really cheap.
Yeah.
And I'm you mentioned Fervo. Fervo has done a fantastic job getting itself into people's minds as the geothermal answer. But I mean, it's fracking, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, frankly, the chance of it happening in Europe is extremely low. I'm an advisor to Ever, so I'm going to just jump in and say Ever.
You mentioned Ever also. Yeah.
Could really, really play an exciting role, you know, in this. And I'm going to get John Redfern onto the show to see if he can persuade anybody that Ever is going to be the thing that complements wind and solar. It's a low temperature, you know, all you need is 150 degrees and you can store, you don't need to run 24/7, but the subsurface loops keep working. And then when you need a burst of power, you can just oversize the generators. I really like it, what can I say?
I think low temperature geothermal could be amazing.
Yeah, and it would be so good because you can then, you know, because otherwise we are looking at some very expensive, potentially solutions. And not that necessarily is a showstopper. I heard a fantastic explanation of, you know, if you can get to 90% with this really low cost stuff, you know, you can do the maths. Supposing you could do 90% of your power, you know, with very low cost renewables, you know, batteries and whatever, you can get there for, let's call it 10% less than conventional, which I think you and I would be like, why 10? That's ridiculous.
Exactly.
Right? But that means that the last 10%, you could do it 9 times current wholesale prices.
That's very
and still end up flat. And you're like, ooh, a budget of 9 times. I mean, hell, you know, I could do that. So,
and I think that shows up in, like, you see the models from Tom Brown in the UK,
yes.
or maybe Christopher.
No, in Germany. Like, he's in Karlsruhe.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That he finds similar things. That overall system cost doesn't have to rise.
Okay, so we're just slightly going to run out of time, and I need to ask you about. I mean, we didn't even talk about. You've got these books, right? And I love it because how did you come up? The titles are so obvious when you read them, right? You've got Nexus, Crux, and the third one is Apex.
Yes.
I mean, it's just this brilliant set of titles, and they're very well received. Are you going to do more of that, or are you going to keep plugging away on the energy forecasting visionary thing, or what are you going to?
I mean, I've told people I am going to write more novels just as soon as the energy transition is done. I will eventually write more novels. So right now, I have joined a stealth mode clean energy startup that I think is amazing. So I was basically a full-time speaker and an investor in clean tech for the last decade. But also things like speaking have slowed down a lot with COVID. And
Tell me about it. Tell me.
I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
There was a company I was advising that at first I thought this is crazy, but looks entertaining. And then I thought, well, this might just work. And then I thought, I really think this has a very good chance of working and being a very big deal. So I've gone from a part-time advisor to a part-time sort of more hands-on consultant to joining full-time. I wish I could tell you more about the company, but I think it can displace, you know, a gigaton of carbon a year, something in that order. and hopefully you'll hear more from us in the coming months.
Can I probe, and can I say, is it a generating technology? Is
It's
it
a generating
demand side?
technology. Yeah, it's a generating technology.
Oh
So,
gosh, and I'm going to keep pushing you for the remaining time we've got. Is it solar? It's got like 20 questions until I find out what it is. It sounds great.
that's as far as I can go today.
But you know, this is amazing,
at least
because,
on air.
yeah, to get you know, the great Ramez to go full time on anything, it better be damn good, right?
Oh, thanks. It is damn good. It's very exciting. It's an amazing team, and that's half the joy. You like working with good people. Right?
That's extraordinary. And this would be, I mean, it's not your first startup, so you know the process, right?
It's definitely the most ambitious startup. I mean, I founded one startup. It didn't really go that far. So this is only my second. There's a number that I've invested in and advised, but this is my first time in more than a decade to get this hands-on, and it definitely has pretty high aspirations. So,
what is your role there? What role are you playing?
I'm the chief energy strategist, actually. So
Cool.
there will be a lot more details I can reveal in hopefully the coming months.
We haven't talked about, you know, where we met on the Shell Advice, but we probably shouldn't anyway. You know, but there is one other topic before we close off. I want to ask you about November, right?
Yes.
By the time this this show airs, we're going to be in, I'm guessing, about the end of September, beginning of October, maybe a month to go before the elections. What's going to happen? Tell us, oh seer of the future.
Well, 2020 has shown us that anything can happen. This year can do anything to us. And 2016 also showed us a lot of surprise. Right now, just for all of that, I would say the data really, really support that the most likely outcome is that Biden wins and the Democrats have better than even chances of taking the Senate. And that data is fixed. Those models have been improved upon substantially from 2016. In fact, if you use the 2016 models, 538 published this, you know, a few weeks ago. If you use the current models, say it's like a 75% chance for Biden to win. If you use their 2016 model, they'd say it's more like a 98% chance for Biden to win. So even after factoring in lots of, you know, new ways to hedge the model, things they missed, properly scaling who the samples for who the electorate is, dealing with people that don't have mobile phones that don't answer, looking at undecided voters and assuming more than break for Trump, all that sort of stuff, it still looks like Biden's going to win. His lead in the polls throughout the year has averaged about twice Hillary Clinton's lead in the polls. If the polling error was the same size as that in 2016, Biden would still win handily, is what the data says right now. So none of that is to say that Trump can't win. My view is, you know, my sober assessment is the best odds are Biden, but absolutely fight as if Trump's about to win, because we really can't afford that.
Well, look, in a way, I'm lucky that I don't have a say in this. I don't have a vote in it. I am probably much more skeptical about the polls, and I do sometimes put myself through the ordeal of watching one of his rallies. Yeah. And I can see I don't say I agree with the appeal, but I can just see him connecting with his audiences. And it's scary stuff. You know, I say that as an international who has watched the US absent itself from the global fight against COVID-19 in a shocking way. And I'm scared. I'm going to be honest, I'm scared.
Has a base that will just never, ever desert him, and that are, you know, see him as almost a slightly messianic figure. The good news is that base is less than 40% of the US electorate. And so what matters, I know it should be like 2, but what matters is what happens in the middle and on the left in voter turnout. And the best proof point is really the 2018 election, because the 2018 election was a referendum on Trump. And the reason the Republicans lost 53 House seats and the Democrats picked it up wasn't because the Democratic candidates were stronger than their Republican opponents. it was because people that normally, it was the highest election turnout in a non-presidential year in the US in more than 50 years. Those people were not voting for the Democratic congressperson running their district. They showed up to vote against Trump.
Right.
And this is what we call negative partisanship. And this year, modulo all the stuff happening with COVID, which throws more of our attention to it, 2020 is likely to be the highest election turnout in the US, since World War II.
So to the point about the 40% that will vote for him, his core and his base, there's some real insight in episode 2, which was with Rachel Kite. She was the climate supremo at the World Bank. She now runs the Fletcher School of Government. And one of the things that Rachel and I talk about in that episode is how do you prepare future leaders to operate in this hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized environment. And hopefully we can reduce that level of devoted, followers of one personality. It won't be in the future. It won't be Trump in 10 years, 20 years, but reduce that partisanship, because it's not healthy if there are 40% who vote for him, whatever he does, and 40% who will vote against him, whatever he does, then that is not a healthy place for democracy to be. And that's where we are. So hopefully we can fix that, as well as all these other things, and as well as you delivering that gigaton a year and hopefully more of carbon emissions reductions. So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Ramez, it's a huge pleasure to have you on Cleaning Up. Thank you very, very, very much.
Michael, a great pleasure for me as well. Best of luck, and I'll come back when the startup comes out of stealth mode and tell you more about it.
So that's my good friend, Ramez Naam. He is a true visionary, one of the first people to truly understand the implications of learning rates in solar and other forms of clean energy. He's an angel investor. He's an author of books, not just books about the future of technology, but science fiction. Truly, he is the man who sees the future. My guest on Cleaning Up next week doesn't just see the future, he tries to help people build it. He's an academic and a thought leader. I first came across him when he was advising the Minister of Energy and Telecommunications in Ireland. I worked with him very closely on sustainable energy for all, energy access in the developing world. He now runs the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. Please join me next week for Cleaning Up with Morgan Bazilian.